G'day everyone, it's James Davis from the Paxode Academy again, and this time I'm joined by Anne from IT Agree. How you doing, Anne?
Good, thanks, James. Good, really good.
You've got a bit of a funny accent there. Where are you from?
I
Where are you
was going to
based?
say the same about you. I'm from Auckland, New Zealand. Yeah.
Awesome. And I, I'm really thankful for you jumping on today because we're going to talk about an extremely important topic around the contracts. It's something
hmm
I've been talking to a lot of people about the need of, and you're an worldwide expert on this for MSPs, so what better person to talk to about contracts than you? So let's dive in. Um,
hmm
can you tell me why contracts are important?
Sure, yeah. So, what we see is that, MSPs are providing amazing services, often so passionate about services that they're providing, but typically really quite concerned about business risk. So on the surface things can look great. Underneath, they're actually carrying around this business risk, not really quite sure how to manage it, what to do about it, and probably thinking that it's part of being an MSP is that you carry business risk. You're reselling things. There's cyber attacks, and it's just one of those things. It's part of being in business as an MSP. But in actual fact, there is a lot that MSPs can do about it, and obviously our focus is on contracts, and MSPs often think that the contract is there just for the worst case scenario, if you face legal proceedings. But actually, there's a whole lot of other areas of business risk that MSPs encounter daily, weekly, monthly, things that, out of scope. I could tell you a lot about those sorts of business risk, but essentially, to respond to your question, why do they need a contract? Is to manage and to reduce those business risks for their business. And think about it. Really, a contract is a written record of what you're agreeing. So, it can be a written record. If you don't write it down, you still have a contract if you're providing services, but you want to write it down because of the complexity of the services being provided by MSP. So you want a written contract is really what we're talking about.
So you mentioned there if you haven't written it down, there's an informal contract. What do you mean by that?
So you don't need a contract to be in writing for there to be an enforceable contract as such. Offer is an offer. You're going to provide some services. The customer is going to accept that offer. You've got to have the right level of certainty around, the nature of the services and the pricing and so on. But you don't actually need to write that down. If I agreed with you to sell you my bicycle, we don't need to write that down in order for you to say, actually, you agreed to sell me the bike and we set the price and so on. We don't need to write that down. But the greater the complexity of what you're delivering and, all the commercial attributes around that, the more it obviously makes sense to write that contract down.
And so from your experience out there in the industry, how many MSPs do actually have written contracts? What would be the proportion?
Well, yeah, I couldn't put a percentage on it, but I think it's a surprisingly high number that still rely on a good old-fashioned handshake, and they believe, their customers trust them, and that's all they need, and they wouldn't want to put a written contract in front of them. And so I don't know the actual percentage, but I think there's still an alarmingly high percentage. And, just on that trust point of course, trust is important and, in fact, it's essential. But trust in itself will cause a lot of problems because, there's too much at stake there, and there are too many details at play for people to understand what they're actually agreeing if they're relying on a handshake.
From my experience, I reckon I'm probably being overly generous, but I'd say 70% probably don't have a contract out there in the wild.
Yeah, well, you
Um,
might not be far wrong, or if they don't have a contract at all in writing, if they do have a contract in writing, it's often not really the sort of contract that is appropriate, because it may have been okay 10 years ago when they've got some general terms and conditions, but with all the nature of the services being provided now, it's really not going to serve you well to have a set of terms and conditions from 5 or 10 years ago, or something that's been cobbled together or borrowed or modified along the way. You really want agreements that suit the specific types of services that you're providing.
So why do you think the majority of the industry doesn't have mature contracts? They've either don't have anything or they've got that cobbled together or
Yeah.
legacy contracts.
I think traditionally, with support services and even moving into managed services from there, there hasn't been anything really much in writing. There has been that trust, and probably it's partially because it's hard to write it. It's hard to write those agreements, and so when I started. As an IT lawyer back in the early 90s, I only spent one or 2 years as a general commercial lawyer in a big law firm, and then I got attracted into the team within the law firm that was looking after Bell South that had come into New Zealand. So I was put onto IT contracts, and before it was probably a little bit like oil and water. Here's your IT, and here's lawyers. Like, what do lawyers know about that? And why and how would we write down what's actually going on, So I think there's still quite a lot of that, is where would an MSP go to get the right sorts of contracts? And if they go along to their local lawyer, the lawyer is likely not to have much, if any, experience in advising managed service providers. So they don't get a good result, and so I guess that means they think, oh well, it's not something I need to really do, or it's not so important because the lawyers don't even know how to do this, and it is a very specialised area. So a lot of lawyers, they might do the MSP's property work, or their lease, their employment, their company structure, but turn around and say, I need, a managed firewall agreement, or I need something when I'm reselling Microsoft Cloud services, or, how do I protect myself against a cyber attack? The lawyer is often not going to have any experience to be able to help with that.
And that obviously not only makes the process more difficult, it doesn't actually help the MSP owner understand their risks and their contractual obligations, and I guess that's the first hurdle, and I guess that's why most people copy other people's contracts, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's that then leads into even if that contract was right for the company that you're borrowing it from, it may not be right for you. So you can see that, and then people start to, oh, that's a good clause, we'll put that in, that's a good clause, and over time they end up with this kind of really, house that Jack built kind of agreement that doesn't really hang together well and doesn't serve, the purpose, which really should be around reducing those areas of business risk.
So with that in mind, what is the components of a good contract at a high level?
So at a high level, there's really two key components. One is, often the part that's typically focused on, which I would call the lawyer's part, and that's the part, where I mentioned earlier that people see contracts as there for the worst case scenario. The lawyer's part kind of focuses on that, and that is, your limitation of liability, your indemnities, your warranties, all those sorts of things that probably, to be fair, not many people apart from the lawyers fully understand. And, you want that in there, of course, but you don't want to be relying on that. What you want is what I call the proactive protection part of the contract, and that is, what are you actually agreeing? What are you agreeing to do, to deliver, to provide? What are you expecting from the customer? What are the commercial elements around pricing, term, and so on? And really getting those parts fine-tuned helps you to stay away from really needing, ever needing, hopefully, what I call the lawyer's part. But you need to bring those two things together into, a contract that works well, that's easy to read, I think that's a really key component. You know, a lot of people have, okay, I've got the contract, tick, I have no idea what it means. Because it's full of legalese, or, you know, you also don't want it full of technical jargon, you know, because if you think about it, you know, your customers, as an MSP, your customers got a really low level of understanding of the services you provide relative to the MSP themselves. So when you come to agree on the services, you want to put that into a language that's meaningful not only to you, but to your customers as well.
I really love that concept around the proactive measures and helping your clients understand what you're actually providing. I'm just going to put you on the spot a little bit. Let's talk about a BCDR, a contract. What are the typical components there that we're talking about on this proactive side that we'd be talking to our clients inside the contract? You mentioned pricing before. What else is there?
So, well, it's going to vary, you know, as to what's in your BCDR service from MSP to MSP. But, you know, obviously you want what is the ongoing monthly service that you're providing. You know, if you look at the disaster recovery plan, when are you going to prepare that? How often are you going to update it? How much input do you require from the customer and how frequently? Is there going to be any testing around, you know, how that plan works, rather than, you know, you're seeing people sometimes will have a BCDR agreement and it might mention, yes, we're going to develop this plan. Does that plan ever get actually written? You know, which is verging onto another area, you know, that not only you need the contract, but you need to actually put into play what's in it, what's expected from both parties in it. So in terms of the BCDR, you know, a key component is, you know, producing that plan a lot of the time. So you'll have provisions around that in your agreement, but then to actually do that, you know, so you don't have the disaster situation and, you know, where's the disaster recovery plan? Those sorts of things, you know.
Okay, so it's the operationalizing the delivery really around that detail. Like I'm assuming we would want to outline things like our retention policies and that level of detail. It doesn't need to be technical, but like what you said, it's so the client understands what they're actually getting.
That's right.
To your point around the trust, this is where the trust gets misaligned, isn't it? Because they're trusting initially that the person's going to do the right things, but then they're unsure what they've actually paid for.
That's right.
That's where the spiral starts.
And I think that you know, if you are putting this in writing, it helps the customer to understand, as you've just mentioned, what they're paying for, because, you know, it's one of those things, you know, if everything's going really smoothly, then the customer doesn't notice any problems. So why am I paying you? There's nothing going wrong, you know. So they need to articulate that to customers and remind them of what's going on, and, you know, things are not standing still. Things are actually, you know, being updated for you, and this is an ongoing process. It's not just a matter of, you know, sign here and then you'll start paying a monthly amount, you know.
And I guess going back to what you're talking about before is everyone gets caught up on the legalese side, which most of us don't understand and our lawyers don't really talk to us about that detail around the proactive side and operationalizing it. So we get caught up in this chaos of unknown. It's not something we're comfortable working in. But what you just pointed out with the proactive side, I think even that, a lot of people are uncomfortable because now they've got to stop and work through that level of detail of what are actually my services.
That's right, and, you know, we find that quite a lot. You know, the MSP, once the agreement, they you know, be prompted to actually define and describe what it is they're doing. And if they're not clear on that themselves, then obviously it makes it very difficult to put that into an agreement. So by going through the process of actually having service-specific agreements, the MSP can actually clarify their service a lot more. You know, if if their service is not well defined, then they're likely to be doing a lot of work that's out of scope without charging anything extra for that. They might be having some projects coming in, or mini projects that start to get treated under a monthly commitment, simply because they haven't really defined what it is well enough for the in scope, out of scope situation to be managed well.
In that scope management is a great point, because I think, going back to what you mentioned before, where people have legacy contracts that they might have done like 5-10 years ago, and the landscape has changed. We haven't updated those contracts in our service descriptions. We all know our clients assume we're doing all the cybersecurity work for them that we've never actually sold or said that we'd provide. That's a prime example of this scope creep.
That's absolutely right. And the same could be said if you're providing one agreement. It doesn't matter what it is. You hit the nail on the head with that. The customer does have the expectation. They make a lot of assumptions about what the MSP is doing if that's not well defined. And so, the MSP in the customer's mind is responsible for all backups, for all cybersecurity. Everything's taken care of, and really, if you look at, in contrast, let's say you've got a firewall. Okay, you're providing that firewall to the customer. Are you also managing that firewall or not? Does the customer understand what they're actually getting for their money? Are they getting the firewall? Are they getting management of the firewall as well, or not? And once you articulate that and define that into service-specific agreements, then it produces that upside of being able to upsell the customer, because the customer is going to be more clear on what they're getting and what they're not getting.
I think we as an industry are generally afraid of this, because I think for a long time, and you touched on this, we've sold the smoke and mirrors of, we'll just take care of your IT. That's how we got people converted onto managed services. We didn't have enough maturity and detail around that. We haven't reset those expectations. So this leads into my next question of, we've gone through this process, we've realized that we need more modern contracts, and we spent time redefining our services, and we've got good maturity there. What's the best way to go and contract clients if we've only ever had handshake agreements? Do we just throw it at them, get them to sign it, or is there a different process to this?
I think, you can just throw it at them and hopefully they would sign it. But I think perhaps a better way is to position if you've never had contracts with a particular customer before, to actually position it as a benefit for them as well. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of customers probably don't like being in the dark either about what's going on. They're paying this money, they really don't know exactly what they're paying for and what they're getting and what they're not getting a lot of the time. And they are increasingly nervous as well about whether everything that's meant to be getting done is done, whether they've got the right range of services from their IT company, whether they need to engage separate, cybersecurity specialists, for example, or, so it can be also a weight off the customer's mind to have this nicely laid out for them as to, this is what you're getting at the moment, this is what you're paying for, this is how it all works, this is what we're not doing for you at the moment, which we could and we recommend, and really put that nice and clearly to the customer. So I think rather than just sending it out, I think it deserves that positioning as a benefit for the customer, because I indeed see it as not just a huge benefit for the MSP, but also a corresponding strong benefit for the customer.
I think there's some great advice, because I think that that reframing and then helping the client understand what you do and you don't do will create a good, healthy level of conversation around, I thought you did cybersecurity. Well, no, that's in this service. We haven't been able to do that because it's extra cost, it's extra work, it's a changing environment, and being able to reframe them. And what I think off the back of this as well is, what's happening, I'm noticing, is a lot more of the client's business advisors are pushing this sort of discussion as well. The insurance brokers, their lawyers, their accountants are pushing the level of maturity of the clients of how they need to operate. And if you as their current provider isn't coming in and having these level of conversations and having it clearly outlined, especially if they've got a board in place and all that sort of risk, you're at threat of being left behind because of your lack of maturity level of the expectations of the clients these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And the insurance amongst those, the insurance is increasingly, they need to have contracts in place with the customers for insurance purposes, and likewise the customer will often need to have those written contracts in place as well. And in the insurance for the customer, there are sections on are all these things taken care of in terms of your IT systems, and so they need to often raise that with the IT company, the MSP, in order to respond to those questions. So the two certainly tie together, but I think the insurance, like the lawyer's part of the contract, is really for that kind of worst case scenario, and the whole proactive piece around what's in, and this leads into time and money savings for the MSP, leads into a drastic reduction in revenue leakages around out of scope, in scope, out of scope, dealing with cyber attacks, dealing with Microsoft under NCE, dealing with reselling other third-party cloud services, dealing with, hey, what's the value of my business when I want to exit in the future? The upsell opportunity that I mentioned. There are so many reasons apart from that worst case scenario to make dealing with contracts a really valuable thing for any MSP. So it's not all kind of doom and gloom and I hate contracts. It's actually like, this is going to be good for you.
I think that's a great mindset to have, and to reiterate your point around the clarity internally and externally about knowing that, it can reduce the amount of backwards and forwards on scope discussions. If like you said, something comes in, it seems like it should be a project and billed separately from our agreement. It's very easy for anyone to go back to what the contract says. It's been agreed to, that's what it is. And it becomes especially important as employee churn is around, both for us as the MSP and the clients, that maybe we all knew inside the MSP what we sold and delivered 5 years ago, but now we've got a whole bunch of new people. How much time does that cause you as the owner or a leader to have to answer all the questions, what's in and out of scope, because you don't have a contract to fall back on? Same as your client, that their management layer has changed. They don't know what's been provided anymore. That time will just add up constantly across a big client base.
That's right. There are various people within both organisations that need to know really what the nature of the service commitments are, what the nature of the agreements are, and it's one thing for it to be in a contract somewhere if that is the case, but it's another thing for that to be known by the right level of people and have that depth of operational consistency with what's in the agreement. Doesn't mean to say that a whole bunch of people in your MSP need to read the contract, but they should really be working in a way that's consistent with what's been agreed.
So the word consistent there is, it just triggered me. What's best practice for contracts as an MSP? Should we have a bespoke one for every engagement that we have? Should we have a completely rigid one that has no flexibility? Is there somewhere in between? What would you usually recommend?
It's good to have agreements that work for most of the services that you provide. You don't want to be spending a lot of time each time you sign up a new client or signing up a new client on a new service, having to go back and get new agreements. So you want to have them set up to suit the services that you're providing, and then hopefully if they're set up appropriately, then when you are signing up a new client or a new client for a particular service, there's not too much to do, so you certainly want some flexibility, but you want to have it set up, and I think that's where a little bit of time going in to see what is our service. It does trigger then, what are the details of your service commitment, and putting some work into that so that your agreements can reflect that.
Okay. Because I think that's an important thing to, I might just use the 80-20 rule, that you want to keep 80% of your contracts the same, and then the 20% that's different is explicitly shown in a way that people can see. Because I've seen way too many times where people have gone and modified each individual contract, even if they've had a template, and then that's caused issues.
Yeah. I mean, it just makes it a lot easier to manage if you know that 80% at least of your contracts are the same or largely the same. And, if you get customer pushback, a lot of the time that pushback is the customer doesn't understand why something is that way. It doesn't mean you quickly jump in and change it. It's often a matter of explaining, this is how we work, this is why it's like this, or, justifying why something is the way it is, because otherwise you are going to end up with, different versions of your kind of so-called standard agreement for everybody, and that makes it harder to manage.
And I guess this is often we jump at it because we don't understand the legalese. I guess so. I'm curious from you, how much do the legals change? You mentioned ages ago that maybe our contracts for 10 years ago don't really fit the modern world. How often is this legislation and stuff changing that can affect our contracts?
Yeah, so there's four main reasons why MSPs would need to update their agreements. Probably, certainly one of those is law changes, but it's the least frequent. The changes that happen more often are, what services is the MSP providing? And, if I said to an MSP, who told me they hadn't updated their contracts for 5 years, have your services changed in the last 5 years? Of course, So, that's one thing. When you change your services, update your contracts to reflect, because it's changing what you're agreeing with the customer. Another one is you start to attract bigger customers or different customers. You need to update your agreements because, you send the same agreement to, a very small company as you would to a very large company. When you start attracting that larger customer, you may not win the business because of that, or it may take longer because of that. So you want to serve up agreements that are appropriate not only for your services but also for the size and nature of your clients. And then another thing that goes on is market changes. So the NCE changes were a good example of that, where MSPs should have updated their contracts around reselling 365 under NCE. So those three, and then the legal change as well. So as I said at the outset to that question, those are the least frequent changes. So the law moves a little more slowly, but all the other things happen more frequently. That said, the legal changes, it's imperative that people do update their contracts with the laws for their jurisdiction.
This is probably a good point of the reason why you need to not treat this project to get contracts as a transactional one and done engagement. It's an ongoing relationship with your lawyer or someone like yourself to keep up with the changes and know when to refresh their contracts and agreements.
Yeah. So time-wise, which you asked me at the beginning of this particular part of the discussion, I would say it's more likely every kind of 6 to 18 months, depending on which service it is and which services you're starting to provide. A lot of MSPs are bringing in more and more types of cybersecurity services. Then they need appropriate agreements for those.
And so, talking about some best practices, you've mentioned a few times like the different services. So what's the sort of best practices around the high-level structures of your contracts? Do you have one contract that covers absolutely everything that you do? Do you have terms and conditions? Do you have a master services arrangement? What sort of best practice in that sort of structural level?
I think it does tend to make sense to have terms and conditions which are general across all of your services in one place, which is like an umbrella over the top of everything, whether that's a master terms and conditions or a master services agreement. probably getting those in the easiest way possible, relevant to the particular laws of your jurisdiction. But in addition to that, obviously having service specific. So if you try and have too few agreements covering too many of your services, that'll just create, for one, confusion with your customers as to what they're actually getting and which part of the agreements apply to them. And it actually increases your business risk. If you try and put too many services into one agreement, immediately the customer is more encouraged to make assumptions and have expectations. Conversely, if you have service specific, it's easier to put effectively like boundaries around each of your services, containing the risk to that particular service and the service commitment to that particular service, meanwhile leaving open the opportunity to upsell other services. So that's what I see is really the best practice for MSPs.
Okay, and just another question that just sparked for me as we were thinking about that is inclusions and exclusions. Do I need to document every possible exclusion that could fall into that type of service, or is it, or do we just base it off what's implicitly included? How does that sort of work?
I think, yeah, the level of detail is really, deciding the level of detail is really a matter of experience. If you have agreements and you're describing things too loosely, then that's going to be adverse for the MSP a lot of the time, because a description that's too general means it's more likely going to be the customer that you want to look after, and so in a loose interpretation, you're going to favour the customer's interpretation as such, or expectation of the service. So that really comes down to probably experience in actually the way things are described, and if you write something into an agreement describing a particular part of your service, look at it from the customer's perspective. Is it the way you expect it, as closely defined as what you're envisaging, or could the customer from your general description have a much broader view of what your service includes? And so that probably gives you some guidance for yourself on the level of detail that's required. There's certain ways that we write contracts and write contractual descriptions, but at the end of the day, they need to be sufficiently certain and sufficiently detailed so as to not create any ambiguity.
That's a very good point. And I think in that process of you developing up that sort of service description stuff, the best thing you can do is go get some friendly parties that are non-technical, that you can walk through this whole process. They'll ask a whole bunch of questions. You'll have to answer them, and you'll find that those detail gaps in the service descriptions that you can fill out, because I think you'll struggle as an MSP owner to know how the client's perceiving it, I think, because you just have all this inbuilt years of assumptions that you're making.
Yeah. It's a really key part of the contract, the way services are described. Often, in a project, in a statement of work, why is that and it's such an important part of the contract? Well, that is the part that I mentioned earlier. What are you actually doing? And you've got to write that with a sufficient degree of certainty.
Just to throw out a question here, is that something lawyers do on your behalf, or is it something that the owners need to actually sit down and do themselves to write out the service descriptions?
Depends on the lawyer, I guess. Typically what the service is needs to come from the MSP, but the way that's actually written, some legal expertise over that is potentially very helpful.
The reason why I throw that up, because I think most owners that I talk to, when I'm talking to them about this contract process and service descriptions, they just want it given to them rather than going through the process, where once I've helped them actually think through this process and understand what they're doing and get them to write it down and give them a structure, they're actually very thankful for going through the process, because all of a sudden they've seen all the ambiguity, they've been able to tighten everything up. Now they fully understand it. Now they can pass it through to their teams, and there's a very valuable process through actually understanding this, instead of trying to palm it off to someone else and have it sort of templatized and silver
Yeah.
bullet solutions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, at the base level, I mean, no one can know what your services are unless you provide that starting point.
I think that's a very good ending point to start to wrap up. It's been a fascinating session for me. I feel like I've learned a lot from you, Ian. What would you like people that have been listening along to this session? What do you want them the main takeaway to be from it, and what are some next logical action steps for people?
Sure. So I think that, well, firstly, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's been really great to talk with you, and I've really appreciated and enjoyed our conversation as well. I think the key takeaways would be: have your contracts in writing, and make sure that your contracts address the sorts of business risks that you're actually concerned about. So that's a really key focus, and often different than having just simply a set of terms and conditions. The next thing would be, in terms of what to do next, have a look at your existing contracts, see how they shape up based on what you and I have discussed, in terms of the proactive element and the lawyer's part. What would your customer think when they get this agreement? Would they understand your service as a result of reading your agreement? Would they understand what it is they can expect out of the relationship and the specific types of services that you're providing? And are you leaving enough room for upsell? And and I think, as you mentioned earlier, it's not a once and done. Think about how often things change in your world, and when those changes occur, think about updating your agreements to suit.
Well, there's some great advice and wisdom you shared with us today, and my final thought as well is the piece of value that we didn't touch on was, not only are they helpful with our client arrangements, it's actually even more helpful to increase our business value when we're exiting as well. So there's
Absolutely.
multiple streams of why this is so important, why we should be doing it. So thank you so much for joining me, Anne. It's been a great conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And I'm sure I'll have you on again in the future, because things change, and we'll get the latest advice in the near future.
Excellent.
So thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, James.